I was not invited to Christmas. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I was no longer needed. So I took the turkey, the gift money, and the one thing they never saw coming, the truth. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel where betrayal, drama, and hidden truths come alive in every emotional story. And let us know where you are listening from in the comments. I stood in the doorway, still wearing the coat I had not taken off, holding the foil-covered turkey in both hands like it was a shield. The words my daughter had just said were still floating in the room, sharp and final. "You should stay home this year, Mom. It is probably better that way." She did not say it with anger. That made it worse. She said it like a nurse delivering a diagnosis, calm, detached, like she had already rehearsed it a dozen times and expected me to agree. I looked at the decorations behind her, twinkling lights, gold-trimmed garland, a tree too tall for the ceiling, and I could not believe I had helped put all that up just 2 days ago. I could still feel the scratches on my arms from fluffing the branches. I had bought those decorations last season when she said she wanted to upgrade the theme, and now I was not part of the theme. The silence pressed hard between us. My hands tightened on the warm tray in front of me, the smell of rosemary and butter rising like an insult. Her eyes flicked down toward it. "You can leave it though. The kids love your stuffing." I did not answer. I walked straight past her, through the house I had helped her build, past the family photos where I had slowly faded from the center of the frame to the edge. I walked out the back door, turkey and all, and did not look back. By the time I reached my car, my heart was beating too loud to hear the music still playing inside. It was December 24th, and my daughter had just uninvited me from Christmas. My name is Eleanor James. I am 46 years old. I live alone in a small 2-bedroom house that smells like cinnamon and old books. I have spent most of my adult life raising a daughter who now tells me without blinking that her Christmas is better without me in it. I was 21 when I had her, fresh out of community college, working 2 jobs and trying to keep a smile on my face even when the bills came faster than the paychecks. Her father left before she turned 2. He said he was not ready for fatherhood, and I suppose he meant it, because he never looked back. So I did it all alone. The night shifts at the diner, the weekend cleaning gigs, the homemade Halloween costumes I stitched together with trembling fingers at midnight, every birthday cake, every school project, every scraped knee. I was there. She used to call me her best friend. I remember the little drawings she would bring home from kindergarten, stick figures with red yarn hair and words she barely knew how to spell. Me and Mommy at the park. I saved every one of them. They are still in a box in my closet taped together with years and tears. I used to think love meant sacrifice. That if I gave her everything, I would never lose, that if I worked hard enough, stayed kind enough, stayed present enough, she would never feel I was a burden. I never expected that the very love I poured out would one day be used as a reason to push me aside, like an old toy, like something familiar, outdated, and slightly embarrassing. Last year she told me I worried too much about the turkey. "This is not the 80s anymore, Mom." She laughed, sipping wine and waving a hand toward her friends. "No one cares about stuffing from scratch." I laughed with her. But that night I stayed up basting the bird anyway. The next morning, the platter was empty in 15 minutes. She never said thank you. That was the first year I saw it. The shift. The one where I stopped being part of the celebration and started becoming part of the setting, present, but silent, helpful but invisible. This year I brought the turkey again. I brought gifts too. A crisp envelope with money for her husband's business, toys for the kids, and a soft wool sweater I thought she would love. I was proud of it, wrapped it carefully, even tied the bow myself. But before I could set anything down, she told me to go home. It is strange how a few words can pull apart decades. I sat in my car with the engine off, and the turkey cooling in my lap, and I wondered what I had done wrong, what page I had missed, What test I had failed. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My lipstick had faded. My eyes were tired. I did not look like the woman in those kindergarten drawings. But I was still her mother. And I was still here. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the half-wrapped gifts on the floor. Silent reminders of a love I had once believed was unshakable. The room felt heavier now, not just with silence, but with the kind of stillness that followed a deep invisible storm. And I was still here with the wrapping paper I had picked out months ago. The kind with tiny gold trees and red velvet bows. I had chosen them with care, as I always did. Not because anyone had asked me to, but because I believed love should be layered in detail. And now those same ribbons felt foolish, like confetti left after a party I had not been invited to. I stood and moved slowly toward the window. Outside, a thin frost stretched across the street, coating mailboxes and tree branches in white. Families passed by bundled in coats, arms full of shopping bags and children skipping beside them. I wondered if any of them had ever been asked to stay home for Christmas. Not because they were ill or far away, but because they were no longer part of the picture someone else wanted to paint. It was not distance that hurt. It was deletion. I ran my fingers across the windowsill, feeling the small chip in the wood where my daughter had once pressed her toy against it too hard. I had never repainted it. I used to say it gave the house character. Now it felt like a scar. Quiet, visible only to me, and tied to a memory no one else remembered. My phone buzzed. I did not check it. I had learned now that not all messages are meant to heal. Some were band-aids over wounds that had not even stopped bleeding. I walked to the kitchen. The smell of roasted turkey still lingered in the air, a scent both comforting and cruel. I opened the fridge and saw the untouched cranberry sauce, the homemade stuffing, the perfectly basted turkey that no one would share with me. I took a breath, then another. I picked up the knife, and I sliced the turkey, not with sadness, but with ceremony. I placed a piece on my plate, sat at the table I had set alone, and began to eat. I imagined the conversations they were having without me. I imagined the laughter, the passing of plates, the wine being poured, the pictures being taken, and I wondered, would they ever feel the shape of my absence? Or had I become so familiar that they believed I would always be waiting quietly in the wings? I swallowed hard. Not just the food, but the truth. The truth that being a mother did not mean being disposable. The truth that love, no matter how deeply rooted, could still be neglected like an overgrown garden, wild, tangled, and eventually abandoned. After dinner I sat with my journal. I wrote today. I ate alone. But I did not feel alone. I felt awake, and that terrified me more than the silence. Because once you wake up, you cannot go back to sleep. Not in the same bed. Not in the same role. Not in the same version of the story where you are always the one bending, breaking, shrinking. No, but I was no longer the same. The next morning I woke before the sun. I stood in the kitchen with the lights off, just listening. The house was quiet. No scent of cinnamon rolls baking. No little footsteps running down the hallway. No wrapping paper crinkling or stockings being emptied. Just silence. I stared at the turkey in the fridge. Untouched. Untouched like me. I should have cried, but I did not. I was too full of something else. Something heavier than sadness. It was not anger. It was not shock. It was something that felt like realization, the kind that comes slowly but finally. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the one with the burn mark in the corner where she once knocked over a candle during a school project. She was 11. We laughed so hard we cried. I never fixed it. I liked the memory it left behind, But memories do not mean anything to people who have already moved on. By mid-morning I checked my phone. No messages, no photos, no group texts of the grandkids opening presents, not even a Merry Christmas from her. I scrolled through social media. Her page was full of smiles, the perfect tree, matching pajamas, her husband's arm around her. The caption read, "Grateful for family, peace and new traditions." So that is what I had become, a leftover from the old ones. It started making sense now, the subtle corrections over the years. The way she shifted holiday menus to more modern dishes. The way she bought store-bought pies even after I brought my homemade apple crumble. The way her friends would arrive and she would lower her voice when introducing me. "This is my mom, Eleanor. She's sweet. Sweet." As if that was all there was to me, as if sweetness was a flaw that needed softening with laughter or apology. I began remembering other things too. The time I showed up at her baby shower with a hand-stitched blanket, and noticed her eyes roll when her college friends brought designer gifts, or how she no longer asked me to sit near the front at school events, preferring I help with snacks in the back. They were small things, but now, like snowflakes in a storm, they had piled up into something impossible to ignore. She had not just uninvited me from Christmas, she had slowly uninvited me from her life. Still, I kept asking myself why. Was it because I reminded her of a past she wanted to shed? Was it because I never had a career to impress her new circle of friends? Was it because I made sacrifices she never asked for, and now resented? I glanced across the room to the small corner cabinet where I kept my keepsake. Inside were birthday cards she drew in crayon, a ticket stub from her first school play, a gold-painted macaroni frame with a photo of us from her 6th birthday. I opened the cabinet. My hands were shaking, not from grief, but from clarity. She had rewritten the script. She had cast me as the supporting role in a story I wrote with my bare hands, and she expected me to applaud her performance from the wings. Not this year, not anymore. I whispered those words into the quiet like a vow sworn in solitude. Not anymore. I was not going to keep pretending, not going to keep showing up in places where my presence was tolerated but not treasured. Not going to keep erasing myself for the comfort of others. I sat still for a long time after writing in my journal, the pen warm in my hand from the pressure of truth. The room around me had not changed, but something inside me had shifted, subtly, yet permanently. I stood and walked to the hallway mirror. For years I had passed by that mirror and only seen what was missing. The wrinkles that deepened after every sleepless night, the grays that bloomed after every disappointment, the curve of a body that had held generations together but never held itself. But now I saw a woman rising from quiet ruins, a woman who had carried love in her bones and betrayal in her back pocket, and still dared to stand tall. I ran a hand over my scarf, smoothing it like armor. There was something sacred in deciding to live for yourself, especially after decades of living for everyone else. Then my eyes landed on the old shoebox on the closet shelf. I pulled it down gently. Inside were letters, most of them from my daughter, scribbles from her childhood, teenage apologies, birthday cards with stick figures and poems that once made me cry tears of joy. One envelope sat on top. It was unopened. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. The postmark was recent. It had arrived the week before Christmas. I had tossed it aside in the flurry of decorations and denial, assuming it was a standard holiday card. But now it felt like something more. I opened it. The card inside read, "Thank you for everything, but this year, we are choosing a new kind of peace." There was no signature, no name, just distance. It was not just exclusion, it was a rebranding of rejection, a quiet dismissal dressed in careful language. I read it twice, then again, and then I reached for the matchbox. I walked to the fireplace, lit a single match, and set the card ablaze. I did not watch it burn with anger. I watched it burn with clarity. I was done carrying the weight of people's silence and calling it grace. Done begging for space at a table I had built with my own hand. Done walking on eggshells, just to keep the peace, when that peace never included my heart. I opened the window and let the smoke drift upward. It was time to release it all. The unspoken expectations, the passive judgments, the love that always came with condition. I whispered again, "Not anymore," and this time, I meant it with every part of me. I stood in the hallway, holding that gold macaroni frame, and something inside me finally settled. Not with peace, but with purpose. For years I had told myself that love meant staying quiet, that loyalty meant saying yes, that motherhood meant fading into the background so she could shine. I had mistaken silence for strength, but now I saw the truth. What she wanted was not love. What she wanted was my obedience. She wanted my presence without my voice, my sacrifice without my boundaries, and I had allowed it. Until now, I walked into my bedroom and pulled out the gifts I had planned to bring yesterday, each one still wrapped, untouched. I sat them down on the bed and stared at them one by one. The envelope with $500 in crisp bills, the soft gray sweater I knew was her style, the wooden toy train set for my grandson, carved by hand, the storybook with her daughter's name written inside. I could not give these things away, not this year, not after being told I was better left behind. I reached for my handbag and pulled out the small leather notebook I always kept tucked inside. It was old, worn, but inside it held every budget, every list, every moment I had written down to make her life easier. Dates when tuition was due, reminders for her dentist appointments, meal plans for picky toddler stages, even recipes she claimed as hers during holidays, written in my handwriting, folded neatly at the back. I turned to a blank page. With a deep breath I began writing. Not a recipe, not a grocery list, but a letter, a real letter. I wrote slowly, clearly, with no apologies. I told her I loved her. I always would. That being her mother had been the most sacred role I had ever known. But I also told her something I had never said out loud, not even to myself, that I would no longer earn my place at her table, that I would no longer carry the weight of being convenient, that love does not silence a person, it does not erase them when the guest list gets long. I signed the letter and placed it carefully into the envelope that once held money. Then, I walked into the living room, pulled the turkey out of the fridge, and set it on the counter. I plated a portion for myself and poured a glass of wine, real wine, not the sparkling cider I usually saved for the grandkids. I sat at the table alone, and I ate every bite in silence. But it was not empty. It was full of something I had not tasted in years. Decision. Later that evening I wrapped the sweater again. But this time, I attached the letter, not for her, for me. I would keep it as proof that I had finally that I had finally drawn a line between what I gave and what I allowed to be taken, that I had at last reclaimed my seat at my own table. It was not a grand moment, no audience, no spotlight, just me, in my kitchen, sipping lukewarm tea with the smell of burned paper still curling through the air. But it was real. I had reclaimed something no one else ever thought to take, because they believed I had given it away freely. And perhaps I had. Over the years I had handed over pieces of myself like party favors. My time, my peace, my silence, my voice. Now I was picking each of them back up like broken china, carefully, deliberately gluing them into something whole. I sat back down at the dining table, the one I used to reserve for holidays and family dinners. The candles were melted low, the plates were rinsed, but still sitting by the sink. It should have felt lonely, but for the first time it did not. It felt earned. Every seat was empty but mine, and that emptiness no longer mocked me. It made space. Space for truth. Space for healing. Space for a woman who had given everything and finally decided to give something to herself. I looked around and noticed details I used to miss, the way the chandelier caught light in the evening, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the scrape on the floor where my daughter's high chair used to be. They were not just memories anymore. They were evidence, proof that I had lived, that I had loved, that I had built a life from scratch and still stood, even when the pieces began to fall. My seat at the table was not just physical, it was symbolic. I had allowed others to dictate my place for so long, whether I was needed, welcome, expected, or dismissed. But tonight, I chose myself. I stood up again and reached for the photo album tucked away on the bookshelf. I had not opened it in years, not since things began to unravel between us. I turned each page slowly. There we were, birthdays, graduations, first steps, scraped knees. Laughter that once echoed through these walls now felt like a song from another life. But I did not cry. I smiled, because every smile in that album had come from a moment I created. They could revise the narrative. They could retell the story, but I held the receipt. I closed the album and placed it on the table beside me next to my journal, my tea, and a single rose I had picked from the bush outside. And in that moment I knew. This table was no longer a place of waiting. It was a place of becoming, and I had, at last, reclaimed my seat. Not for approval, not for validation, but for truth. For me. The next day, December 26th, I woke up without the usual ache in my chest. There was no text, no missed call, no apology from my daughter. Nothing. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt no urgency to fix it. I made myself breakfast, eggs, toast, and a cup of fresh coffee. I set the table with the good placemat, the one I usually saved for guests who never came. I turned on the radio, letting the old jazz station fill the room like warm sunlight. I sat in silence, not because no one was speaking to me, but because I was listening to myself. There was a different kind of quiet in the house now. It was not the silence of rejection. It was the silence of space I had finally claimed back. But consequences come in many forms. By noon, a message arrived. Not from my daughter but from her husband. It read, "Hope your holiday was peaceful. Just so you know, the kids missed you. Hope we can talk soon." I stared at the message for a long time. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a soft nudge. A tug toward guilt, toward softening, toward being the one to reach out again, as if my absence was just a misunderstanding, as if I had not been asked to remove myself. I did not reply, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. For years I had blurred the line between being loving and being available. I thought that the more I gave, the more I proved my worth. But I had learned now. Giving endlessly does not earn you a place, it only teaches others to expect you to show up empty. In the late afternoon, I went for a walk. The sky was pale gray, the air sharp with winter. I passed houses wrapped in lights, laughter leaking out from open windows. I did not envy them. I envied no one, because for the first time I was not performing. I was not pretending. I was not adjusting myself to fit into a space where I was not wanted. I was simply being. Later that evening, I opened my closet and pulled down the old box of her childhood drawings. I took each one out, one by one. I sat on the floor with a cup of tea, and I read them like chapters of a life I had lived fully and without regret. There was one that caught my eye, a drawing of a tall woman in a red dress, holding hands with a little girl. In the corner, written in shaky early handwriting, "My mommy always comes back." That little girl had not spoken to the woman I was now, not in years, and I was done chasing her shadow. I folded the drawing gently and placed it back inside the box. Then I closed the lid, stood up, and lit a single candle on the mantel. Not for tradition, but for peace. Not revenge. Not validation. Not some grand declaration on social media, but for peace. And peace, I had learned, was not quiet, it was deliberate. It was choosing silence over spectacle, distance over dysfunction, solitude over self-betrayal. I walked through the house with a slow rhythm, my fingertips grazing the edges of photo frames, forgotten notes, old souvenirs from vacations long past. Each object held echoes, but not all of them were soft. Some whispered, others screamed, but none had power over me now, because I was not looking for answers anymore. I was choosing peace. I opened the closet where the gift bags were stored, Bright glossy ones I had once stuffed with scented candles, sweaters, picture frames, gifts wrapped with careful hands and hopeful hearts, gifts I would carry to houses where I never fully felt at home, only tolerated. Not this time. I began folding the bags away, gently, but firmly. Each fold felt like closure. I had nothing to prove, nothing left to hand over to people who would receive my efforts with politeness, but not with love. The house creaked, the wind tapped lightly at the window pane, and in that soft, haunting moment, I felt the ghost of my old self watching me, tender, exhausted, still hoping for a return to what never truly was. I did not flinch. Instead, I whispered, "You did enough," and then I let her go. I returned to the kitchen, where the lights were low and the candles had melted to waxy shadows. I poured a glass of wine, not to celebrate, not to drown anything, but to mark something sacred. I toasted, not to the past, but to the piece I had carved from the bones of my disappointment. It tasted like freedom. Not loud, not sweet, but clear. It was in the way I did not pick up the phone when it rang later that night. It was in the way I let the voicemail pile up like snow untouched. It was in the way I chose not to check social media, to see the pictures they posted without me. I already knew what they would say. I already knew the roles I had been assigned in their story, but I was no longer reading from that script. I was writing my own. I turned off the lights, one by one, and walked to my bedroom. I did not double-check the locks. I did not scan the hallway for what was left undone. I slid under the covers and let the stillness wrap around me like truth. For the first time in years I fell asleep, not from exhaustion, but from peace. It was 3 days after Christmas, when she finally called. Not a message, not a text, a real call. I stared at the screen as it buzzed in my hand, her name glowing like a question I was not sure I wanted to answer. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then I pressed accept. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Hi, Mom. I thought we should talk." I said nothing at first. I let her sit in the space she had created. She continued, "I think there has been a misunderstanding." I kept my voice steady. "No, there has not." There was a pause. I could hear her breathing, could hear the tension she had not expected. "I was just trying to make Christmas easier," she said. "It was not meant to hurt you." "Easier for who?" I asked. "For everyone," she replied too quickly. I stood by the window watching snow begin to fall, each flake soft, quiet, unbothered by anything except gravity. I wanted to speak carefully, not to hurt, not to accuse, but to tell the truth. "You did not ask me how I felt," I said. "You decided I would be better removed." "That is not true," she said, but her voice cracked. "I brought food, I brought gifts, I brought history, and you gave me the door." "Mom, I did not mean," I interrupted, not to silence her, but to hold my space. "You did, you meant it, and that is why it hurt." There was silence. Then she said something I had not heard from her in years. "I do not know how to fix this." I closed my eyes. "Maybe you do not need to fix it," I said. "Maybe you just need to see it, all of it, everything I have done, everything I have swallowed, everything I have allowed for the sake of peace that never included me." She began to cry, quietly, the way she used to when she was a child and could not understand why something hurt more than she expected. "I miss you," she whispered. I felt the ache rise in my throat, but I did not let it speak for me. "You miss what I gave. You miss the comfort, the presence. But do you miss me?" "I think I do," she said, "but I do not know how to get that back." "You do not get it back," I said softly. "You earn it forward." More silence. Then she asked, "Can we try again next year?" I answered without hesitation, "I will not try. I will show up as myself, fully, not as your helper, not as your placeholder, but as your mother." "Okay," she said, her voice smaller. "I understand. I hope you do," I replied. And then I ended the call, not out of anger, but because I had finally said everything I needed to say, not to them, but to myself. And that was the difference. I had spent years rehearsing speeches in my mind, what I would say if they listened, how I would defend myself if I were ever confronted, how I would explain the pain I never showed, but none of them ever asked. So I stopped waiting. I said it all in the stillness of my room, in the margins of my journal, in the corners of a home that had become a witness to my unraveling and rebuilding. I said it without needing permission. I said it without tears, and I said it not to be heard, but to be free. It had been days since Christmas morning. The tree still stood in the corner of the living room, its lights blinking steadily like a heartbeat. I had chosen not to turn off. Not yet. There was something in that quiet glow that reminded me of who I used to be. Hopeful, patient, endlessly giving. She was still here, but she no longer needed to beg for space. I found myself reaching for my phone, not to call but to delete the group chat, the old voicemails, the saved birthday reminders that only went one way. I scrolled through pictures, hovering over each one with a strange reverence, and then slowly, I began to let go, not out of bitterness, not out of anger, but because I had finally said everything I needed to say. I had told myself the truth, that I had given enough, that I had shown up even when it hurt, that I had stayed long after love had gone silent. I had told myself that choosing peace over proximity was not selfish. It was survival, and once I said those things aloud, even if no one else heard them, I no longer needed their permission to move on. Later that evening, I walked to the porch. The air was crisp, and the stars hung low like they were listening. I wrapped myself in a shawl, sat on the old wooden bench, and let my mind wander, not to the past, but forward. What would life look like without waiting for an invitation that never came? What could joy look like when it was not borrowed from the approval of others? I did not have the answers, but I was willing to find out. Inside, the house stood still but no longer heavy. It had become a sanctuary, not of grief, but of grace, and I had filled it with something I never knew I was allowed to claim: my truth. Not the version others accepted, not the edited one made for family peace, but the whole quiet raw truth that had waited years for a voice, and I had finally given it one. Not to win, not to punish, but because I had finally said everything I needed to say. The new year came with cold mornings and quiet afternoons. I had resumed my routines. Morning walks, journaling, tending to the small winter garden behind my porch. My phone stayed mostly silent, except for the occasional message from acquaintances wishing me well. But then, one afternoon in mid-January, I received a call from Linda. Linda was an old friend, one of the few who had known me before motherhood swallowed my identity whole. We had drifted apart over the years, mostly because I no longer had the energy to keep up appearances, but Linda had always been kind, direct, and unafraid to speak truth. I saw something online, she said without preamble. I think you should know. My stomach tightened. What is? I asked. She sent the link. It was a video, a short, polished, well-lit video that my daughter had posted as part of her online blog. She had started it years ago to talk about motherhood, marriage, and family dynamics. It had grown, with thousands of followers and brand sponsorship. I never followed her publicly. I preferred to support her silently, from the shadows like always. The video was titled, "When You Realize Some Traditions Are Too Toxic to Continue." I pressed play, and there she was, looking effortlessly beautiful. Her voice was calm, her tone was rehearsed. She spoke about boundaries, about choosing peace over obligation, about removing toxic energy from holiday spaces. She did not mention me by name, but the subtext was unmistakable. She spoke of a mother who never respected her lifestyle, who demanded traditions be followed, and who used guilt as a weapon. She said she had made a bold decision to protect her children from inherited emotional manipulation. The comments were full of praise. "You're so brave. Breaking generational cycles is hard, but worth it. Thank you for normalizing this." Each one felt like a dagger twisting deeper, not just into my heart, but into my legacy. She had not just distanced herself, she had rewritten the story entirely. And this time, she had an audience. I sat there, frozen, not in shame, not in regret, but in awe. I had always thought silence was the worst pain, but I had discovered something deep. Being erased publicly, being painted as a villain in a story I bled to build, was a grief I had no name for. I closed my laptop, I stood up, I walked to the mirror, and I looked at myself, not as the woman she described, but as the woman I had become. I was not toxic, I was tired, I was not manipulative, I was generous beyond reason, I was not the villain, I was the one who showed up every time, in every season, with arms full of love and hands that never stopped giving. And maybe the world would never know, but I would, and that was enough. Until the doorbell rang the next morning, sharp, insistent and entirely unexpected. I paused at the top of the stairs, robe tied loosely around my waist, heart thudding in a way I had not felt in days, the kind of thud that comes when peace is about to be tested. I moved slowly, cautiously, as if approaching something sacred or cursed. Through the window, I saw a man in a gray jacket holding a white envelope. It was not a package, it was not a neighbor, it was a courier, and that meant one thing. Someone had sent me something that could not be emailed, something meant to be felt, or feared. I opened the door with a practiced calm. He nodded, handed me the envelope, and said nothing. When I closed the door, I stood frozen in the hallway, envelope in hand, time suspended. The handwriting on the front stopped me cold. It was hers, my daughter's. I opened it with trembling fingers, breath catching in my throat. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no greeting, no sign-off, just words. I hope you feel better now that everyone knows. That was it. No explanation, no context, but I knew. I rushed to my laptop, opened my browser, and there it was, shared like wildfire on Facebook, whispered in tight circles on family group chats, reposted by people who had not spoken to me in years, a screenshot of an old journal entry I had once written, words I had long deleted from my mind, but apparently, not from a forgotten backup drive, words that told the truth about everything, the loneliness, the favoritism, the years of being used and discarded, my regrets, my rage, my raw, unfiltered pain. She had shared it, publicly, to punish me, to silence me, to take back the control she felt she lost when I stopped begging. And yet, as I stared at the screen, heart pounding in my ears, I did not panic, I did not cry, because the truth was, I had already said everything I needed to say. Yes, she tried to turn my truth into a weapon. Yes, it would sting when friends called pretending to be concerned. Yes, I would be judged, again, for breaking the illusion of the perfect mother. But what she did not know was that peace cannot be undone by exposure. I had already lived, already survived it, already forgiven myself. I closed the laptop slowly, and stood up straighter. The air felt different, lighter, because there was nothing left to hide. No more secrets, no more roles to perform, no more apologies for the story I lived through. If anything, she had done me a favor. She freed me from ever needing to explain again. Let them read it, let them whisper, let them misunderstand. I knew the truth, and the truth had already set me free, not because they believed it, but because I did. Peace had not arrived like a trumpet, it had arrived like snowfall, silent, cold, clean. The storm of exposure had passed. My daughter never reached out again, neither did I. For the first time in my life I did not chase closure, I lived it. I stopped explaining my version of the story. I stopped hoping others would choose to remember what I gave them. Instead, I began giving to myself. I joined a pottery class. I started journaling again, not to bleed out pain, but to build a home for my thoughts. I went to the movies by myself and did not pretend to be waiting for anyone. I bought a new dining table, small, round, just enough for two, because maybe someday I would invite someone in, but for now, I was enough. There were days I missed, not the woman she had become, but the child she once was, the little girl who would braid my hair while humming off-key Christmas carols. Sometimes I would see a mother and daughter laughing in a cafe, and grief would punch the air from my lungs. But I let it pass through me, because grief, I had learned, was love that no longer had a place to go, so I gave it one. I planted a tree in my backyard. I called it Mercy. Every morning, I sat beside it with my tea and spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the version of myself that had been silenced for too long. And every evening, when the sun dipped behind the fence, the leaves would catch the last light, and shimmer, as if to say, I hear you. On the anniversary of that Christmas, I roasted another turkey, not out of tradition, but because healing had finally given me an appetite. I set the table for one, used the good plates, poured wine, lit candles, and I did not cry, because I had not lost a family. I had gained myself, and I was the kind of woman worth coming home to, no longer waiting at someone else's door, no longer shrinking to fit someone else's comfort, no longer afraid of being alone. I had walked through fire, and came out holding nothing but my truth. That Christmas, I raised my glass to no one, and to everyone, and whispered, Thank you for leaving me behind. It is how I found the way back to myself. And as the snow fell outside my window, soft and undemanding, I closed my eyes, not into the ending of a story, but into the beginning of everything I had almost forgotten I deserved. I may have walked away without a seat at their table, but I found something far greater: my voice, my truth, and my peace. They chose silence, I chose self-respect, and in that quiet, I remembered who I truly was. Here at RL's Circle, your story matters too. If this touched something deep within you, stay connected, subscribe, share, and join the conversation in the comments, because sometimes the real question is not why they left you out, but why you kept waiting for their invitation in the first place.